Everyone say hi to my cat, Lily. Hi, it's me, Lily. Hello, and welcome to Crochet 100, the first module in our Crochet Crash Course that's going to take you all the way from Crochet Novice to Crochet Master. Also, try saying Crochet Crash Course 5 times in a row really quickly, because that's now my new favorite tongue twister. Good luck. In this video, I'm going to give you a quick introduction to the modules that make up this course, a course outline, if you will. And once we're done with that, we can jump right into Crochet 100, which is going to go into the foundations of crocheting. Let's start really simple with an introduction to the course. We're going to talk about who this course is for, what it's about, what can you walk away with, and when and where can you find the course. Once we've established that, we can start Crochet 100, which is the first module in this course. So we're going to talk about things like what is crocheting, the basic materials like hooks and yarns, and then we're going to talk a lot about terminology, and that's going to include things like stitches, slip knots, chains, you name it. Anything that you've heard floating around in the world of crocheting that you're not quite sure what is, we're going to talk about that today. I won't overload you with terminology, we're just going to talk about what you need to get started. Once we're done with that, we can talk about materials that you need and materials that you really don't need. All right, let's jump right in. First on the list, who is this course for? This course is tailored towards absolute beginners. So a lot of the terminology and the way that I explain things is going to be as though you've never heard those terms before and you have no idea what they mean. However, even if you're someone who's crocheted quite a bit, maybe you know how to make a mean kitchen towel, but you don't quite know how to get to the point of doing amigurumi or some more complex crochet projects, this course might also be really helpful for you. And who knows, maybe even a seasoned crocheter could find something useful here. Next up, what even is this course about? Well, glad you asked. We're going to make our way through 10 different modules, all the way from Crochet 101 to Crochet 401. Now, each of these modules is going to build on the information that we learned on the previous one. And the way that we're going to make sure that you're retaining all of this information is through assignments at the end of each module. Once you get to the last module, your assignment will be to put together all of the different pieces that you've crocheted as part of your previous assignments, and you're going to get a super awesome final project. And that's going to take us into what are you going to walk away with from this course. Of course, first off, you're going to walk away with great skills like how to crochet, hello, which is hopefully what you're here for. But that includes things like how you can start off a crochet project, magic rings, granny squares, increasing and decreasing, reading patterns, all of these fun things that seem so scary, but I promise they're not. As much as I can tell you that you're going to walk away with all of these amazing techniques and all of these amazing buzzwords, the main thing that I want people to walk away from this course with is transferable skills that are going to help you to continue to elevate your crochet art. All of these skills mean nothing if you don't know how to apply it and if you don't know how to keep growing, especially if that's something you want to do. And of course, you're going to walk away with your final assignment that I mentioned, and that is going to be a, drumroll please, crochet cardigan! So the last piece of information about the course is when and where you can find it. So for the next 10 weeks, you can come right back here to get your new module and assignment, which I don't know if anyone's ever excited about assignments, but hopefully you will be, because you're going to get a crochet cardigan out of it. So it's going to be worth it, I promise. I'm also going to be creating a playlist called Crochet Crash Course on my channel, so you can find all of the videos in one place really easily in order. All right, now that we've got that out of the way, let's dive right into Crochet 100, which is the first module in this course. As I mentioned before, we're really going to focus on the foundations of crocheting in this module. First off, real nice and easy, what is crocheting? A lot of times you look at crocheting and you're like, wow, that's crocheting. Who really knows what it is? I don't know. Everyone kind of eventually gets there, but maybe I can explain it a little bit. Really, at its very core, it's using a hook, which is a crochet hook, and yarn to create a textile, is the fancy word for it. But I like to call it a piece of yarn crocheted together. Crochet. But really, that is what crocheting is. It's using a hook to make little stitches out of yarn and creating a finished piece of textile. And that could be anything. That could be a shirt, that could be a skirt, that could be a really cool hamper for your dirty clothes. It could be a hat for your cat. It can be whatever your heart desires. That's all well and good though. You could Google what crocheting is. I didn't really have to say anything or explain anything, because really when people talk about crocheting, they kind of already know what it looks like. More importantly is, what is crocheting to you or to me or to any other crocheter? To me, crochet is relaxing. It's also a way for me to keep my hands occupied if I'm doing something like watching TV or listening to an audiobook. It's a way for me to focus on something that requires a little more mind work and brain on time. But most importantly, crochet is a way for me to express my creativity, and that's both for myself and for others. I love crafts. I love hand making things. Growing up, handmade cards were the best thing you could give someone in my family. And so having a really, really fun art that is relaxing, that is a great way for me to concentrate on other hobbies at the same time, and that gives me really fun little gifts that I can give to people that I love, it's such a win-win in my books. So if you're someone who enjoys crafts, and if you're someone who loves hand making things, either for yourself or for other people, this is such a good hobby to do that with, and it's such a great way to just spend your time, get something awesome out of it, and just overall feel accomplished. Now that we've established that literally every single person on the planet should crochet, let's get into the two core materials that you need for crocheting. And really, that's hooks and yarn. Let's start with hooks. This is a crochet hook. On this end is the hook, or the head of the hook. You can see the curved area, and that area right there is what's going to be pulling yarn into stitches and actually making a crocheted piece. On this end is the handle. There's really nothing else to see other than the place that you're going to be holding your hook. Now, there are two main categories that divide crochet hooks. As you can see, there are a bunch of different styles of hooks here. Over here, we have steel hooks, and over here, we have aluminum hooks. We also have ergonomic hooks over here. There are also wooden hooks. Don't mind the difference in size, but really, I only buy different hooks based on the projects that I need them for, and as you can tell, this one was definitely a necessary hook in comparison to my other hooks. So those are some of the most common hook materials that you're going to see. As you can tell, I have quite a few aluminum hooks and steel hooks. That's because aluminum is my preferred material. Even with my ergonomic hooks, I still got aluminum because that is the style that I prefer. As you continue to grow and crochet, you will try different hooks, and you will find what materials you like and the materials that feel comfortable for you. So feel free to try out different hooks. However, as a beginner and as you're starting out, aluminum hooks are likely the easiest way to go. They're the most common to find, they are the cheapest to find usually. The other category that divides hooks are, as you can see, size. Let's take a look at two different hooks and compare their sizes. Here, we're going to take what says 3.25 mm. And here, we're going to take what says 5.50 mm, which is the first hook that we started with. If you look closely, maybe not that closely either, you can tell that they look quite different. So what is the cause of the difference in hook sizes, and how can you tell which ones are different? Well, it's all in the numbers that we mentioned before. This one says 3.25, and this one says 5.50. The mm stands for millimeters. The millimeters tell you how wide the head of a certain hook is. The wider a head is, the more millimeters it will be. For this being a 3.25 millimeter hook, it means that the head is 3.25 millimeters across, which is really not that big. With this being a 5.50 millimeter hook, it means that the head is 5.5 millimeters wide. Again, now when you look at the heads, that probably makes a little more sense. So when a pattern or a tutorial says that you need a 5.5 mm hook, you're going to know that what it means is you need to have a hook that is 5.5 millimeters wide on the head. And what that means is it's going to affect the size of the stitches that you get, because as you're making a stitch, the head and how big this hook that you're pulling stitches through with is going to make a difference on how big your stitch turns out. When we're looking at good beginner hooks, this is the one I would recommend. The 5.5 millimeter aluminum hook is a really nice, easy hook to learn with, to get used to, and to get comfortable with crocheting. If you're using something like this hook that we spoke about before, the 3.25, that is a tiny, tiny hook. It is going to be really hard for you to get a hang of how to make stitches, how to see your mistakes when you're using a hook that's this small. However, using a hook this size is going to give you a much better view of your stitches, and you're going to be able to learn a lot quicker and a lot easier. There's also a relationship between hook sizes and yarn, but we can come to that in a few minutes when we talk about yarn. Let's talk about swapping sizes instead. As you can see, there's so many different hooks here. You might be asking, are you saying I need every single one of those hooks to crochet? Very quickly, the answer is no, you do not. Here's what I would recommend. If you see a tutorial or a project that says you need a hook size that you don't have, see if you can swap them out for something else. My suggestion would be sticking within 1 millimeter difference of a hook. Let's take these two hooks, for example. Here we've got a 6 millimeter hook, and here we've got a 5 millimeter hook. Now, if you were doing a project and they asked you to get a 4 millimeter hook, and you'd say, well, these are the two hooks I have, buddy, you can use a 5 millimeter hook. And the reason for that is the difference between this hook and a 4 millimeter hook is not going to be much. Let's compare these two hooks itself. These are exactly 1 millimeter apart. When you're looking at the heads, it's not that big of a difference. You should be pretty safe to move from a 5 millimeter hook to a 6 millimeter hook and not really notice the difference. However, if someone says that you need a 3 millimeter hook for something, I really wouldn't recommend using a 5 millimeter hook for it. Let's take a look at a 3 millimeter hook. I lied, I don't have a 3 millimeter hook. I have a 2.75 millimeter hook, which is close enough. Comparing a 2.75 millimeter hook to a 5 millimeter hook, that is a big difference as opposed to these two. So the next time that you're looking at a pattern or a tutorial and someone says you need a 4 millimeter hook and all you have is a 5, you can still use the 5. But I wouldn't suggest using a 6 if they asked for a 4. Alright, great. You now know a ton about crochet hooks, but the one thing you don't know is how to hold a crochet hook. So let's talk about grips. There are two different types of grips. You have the pencil grip and the knife grip. Let's start with the pencil grip. You guessed it, it's like a pencil. You pick it up like a pencil, and then you hold it that way, and it rests on your middle finger with your index finger up here. You can usually rest your thumb on the indent on which you'll have the number or the size of your hook. And then you would drive in with your index finger. That is what would make your crocheting motions. The knife grip, which is my preferred method, is maybe a little easier to use, especially as a beginner. I would place my thumb again on that indented part of the crochet hook and wrap my fingers around it until I find a comfortable angle for it. I then extend my index finger onto the side of the hook, just like that, and I use my index finger to drive my hook as I crochet. That is my grip. The most important thing about your grip is that it's comfortable and it gives you full control over where you want your hook to go. If you're going to be holding it in a really awkward way and you actually have no control over where it goes, that's not a good grip. So you can get a hang of using different grips by driving in and trying to do wave-like motions and see if you actually have control over it. Now that you're familiar with hooks and a little more comfortable with the concept, let's move to yarn, and we can go over everything that you need to read that little label on a yarn skein so that you can pick the yarn that you like best and you know which ones to use for which projects. Let's use this ball of yarn or this skein of yarn to learn how to read everything on the labels. This is a pretty standard skein of yarn that you're going to see when you go to the store. You're usually going to find either the yarn name or the brand name somewhere on this front part of the label. Over here we have a name of a style of yarn, and here we have the company name, Loops and Threads. Here we have a general vague idea of what this yarn might look like once it's crocheted. Here's the fun part. Over here we have a number, 285 yards. That tells us how long this skein of yarn is. You're going to get 285 yards worth of yarn from this skein. It really depends on the information that you have about what you're making, but usually knowing the yards of a skein is not telling you much information. As you progress, and especially if you're using patterns or tutorials that talk about the yards, it might be useful to look at this to understand how many skeins of yarn you'll need for a project. The other measurement you have there is 4.5 ounces. That just says how heavy this ball of yarn is. They also have the same measurements, just in meters and grams. Moving down, you'll see a symbol that you'll see on all yarn skeins. It's a little mini yarn skein with medium and the number 4 written on it. This tells us the weight of this yarn in comparison to other yarns. Now there's a weighting scale that yarns follow, going all the way from 1 to 7, with 1 being super fine and 7 being jumbo. 4 is a happy medium in that scale. This means that it's not too thin and it's not too heavy. This is also helpful when you're in a store and you're wondering what the difference between one yarn and another is. They might look very similar, but they could have different weights. That means that it might be a little thicker or a little thinner, and that's going to affect the bulkiness of your final project. Next up, we have a gauge swatch. Now we're going to come back to this in a little bit because there are a few other things that you need to know to really understand what this means and why it's important, but you will see it on all yarns as well. Now this is another very important thing to look at on yarn labels. You can see a little crochet hook and you can see 5mm written on top of it and US H/8. Now this US is specifically a US sizing. I live in Canada, all of my hooks are by millimeters, so I don't use this specific US sizing. If you're in the US, of course, it'll make more sense because this is what will show up on your hooks, and that'll allow you to match hooks to the yarn. The 5mm hook recommendation says that this yarn is best suited for 5mm hooks. It means you're going to get a certain type of stitch and a certain type of finish that is desired for this specific type of yarn. That is not to say that you cannot use another size yarn with it. It just means that if you use a smaller hook, this yarn might be a little tougher to work with because it's not meant for smaller hooks to be used in it. It's going to feel a lot bulkier when you're using it with a smaller hook. And that means that it's going to be a little harder to get into the stitches and to really get a nice even look. If you use a bigger hook, it means that you're going to get airier, looser stitches with more spacing in between them. If that's what you're going for, then that's fine. You can use whatever size hook you want. This is a recommendation on how to get the neatest looking stitches from this specific type of yarn. Now these are usual laundry symbols. This symbol will tell you what temperature you should be washing this yarn at in a laundry machine. This symbol says that you just should not bleach this yarn, which hopefully you wouldn't be doing anyways because you'd be buying it for the color. This says that you need to tumble dry it on low heat. This is do not iron and this is do not dry clean. Honestly, this is going to go for most yarns. The only thing that will change is the temperature at which you're washing it and whether you can tumble dry it. There might be some that are hand wash only, especially when you get to finer and more delicate yarns, but if you're using things like this specific yarn, you should be fine to throw it in the washing machine if you have a sweater that's crocheted out of this type of yarn. The other main thing that you need to know about yarn is the material of the skein that you're buying. Over here, the material is written here. it says 100% acrylic. Acrylic yarn is one of the easier yarns for beginners to learn on. You might be wondering what all of this information is on this yarn. This is specifically because this yarn includes a pattern. Most times, yarn labels will include fun little patterns, but this is specific to this pattern that's included for this blanket. So it won't tell us much about using the yarn in general. It will tell you how many balls of yarn you need for it and which hook size you need to use for it. It really only matters if you want to do the pattern that's included on the label, and it'll be included on the underside of the label once you open it. Now that we know how to read a yarn label, let's look at all the different materials of yarn that you can get. As I mentioned, this is acrylic yarn. Acrylic is the most common for beginners, and that is what we will be using in this course. The reason why I picked this is because it is flexible, soft, and cheaper by comparison. It's stretchy and it's forgiving. Now the reason it's easier has to do with the flexibility. If a yarn is more flexible, it means that it is stretchier. It's not stretchy in a sense of elasticity, it just means that it's a little more forgiving, especially when it comes to breakage. I can pull this yarn really tight and it will not break. And that's great when you're a beginner, because as you continue to make mistakes and undo yarn, it's going to get weaker and weaker. If you're using a delicate, fragile yarn, for example, if you're using lace, that's going to tear it with minimal exertion. This yarn, however, as I demonstrated, just does not budge, which is exactly what you want as a beginner. Acrylic yarn can be used for a ton of different projects. It can be used for things like clothing, amigurumi, stuffed animals, baby clothes, anything, you name it, it can probably be done with acrylic yarn. Some of the other common types of yarn are wool. This is a very thick and soft yarn and is usually used for warmer projects where you might be doing things like sweaters or toques or mitts. Wool, in comparison, is a little more expensive. Cotton is another common material. It tends to be a little coarser and rougher, but cotton is usually used for things like home decor or summer clothes, things that need either breathability or, when stitched really closely together, absorbency. Then there are silk or satin feel yarns. These are smoother or slippery yarns, and they're usually thinner and a little bit more delicate. They are used for any shiny projects that you might want to do, and that's really down to you. It could be used for clothing, for home decor, for accessories, anything that you want a little bling to. Blanket yarn is another common yarn that you'll see quite a bit. It's very, very thick and very warm, and it's specifically made for blankets. You can try to use it for other projects, but I wouldn't recommend it. Again, these are just some of the common ones. There are so many other specialty yarns that are used depending on your project. As you continue to grow and as you continue to crochet, there'll be really exciting yarns for you to try out, and you can get a whole bunch of textures and looks and finishes on same projects but with completely different yarn. So really, the yarn world is yours to explore. Hooks and yarns. They're like wine and meat. You want to make sure you're pairing the right one. A white wine is great when it's paired with white meat, not when it's paired with red meat. Okay, I don't really care, I just drink wine with anything. But you want to be a little more careful with hooks and yarn, because it can really make or break your project and how it looks. For yarns that are silkier or slippery, you want to use bamboo or wood hooks. That's because the bamboo or the wood gives it just naturally a better grip. So when you're working with yarns that tend to slip off of the hook a little easier, having a hook that lends to the grip is always helpful. When you're crocheting with lace or other delicate yarns, you want to use hooks like steel hooks, because that strong steel is going to prevent breakage and it's going to make it easier to work with a finer, thinner type of yarn. For thick, bulky yarn like blanket yarn, you might want to lean more towards big wooden hooks or big plastic hooks. Personally, I prefer wooden hooks for them. It gives me, again, a little bit more of grip on a yarn that tends to be slippery and a little harder to work with. I wouldn't suggest something like aluminum. I don't believe they make larger aluminum hooks as well. They're a little harder to come by, whereas plastic and wood hooks are easier to come by in the bigger sizes. For most other yarns, it's really up to you and the type of hook that you'd like to use based on comfort levels, preference, and maybe just what you have available. Now that we have all of the basic materials out of the way, let's talk some terminology. Let's start off really strong with slip knots. This is the basis of all of our crocheting projects. Here is what a slip knot looks like. A slip knot basically acts as a knot that's going to let you work without your yarn unraveling from the bottom. As you can see, it's a little loop that you create with a hook. And this hoop is what you put your hook in and start crocheting your work in. Now that we have a slip knot on our hook, we can talk about foundation chains. Now a foundation chain is again, well, the foundation of a crochet project. That's what you're going to build your stitches into. As I said, a slip knot is going to keep your work from unraveling from the bottom. So now you can work and start creating stitches or a foundation chain. This is what a foundation chain looks like. This is the front of your chain, and this is the back of your chain. You can see the back has these little bumps along the back, and the front has a nice, even little V shape running across. Now, chains can determine the width of your project. If I were to be making a square of fabric, this is how wide my project would be. Unless I were to add stitches as I kept crocheting up, this is really the maximum width of my project. Now that we have the foundation chain, we can start making stitches. Now a stitch is what really makes your yarn look like a project that you'll see in pictures or in tutorials. So let's get our hook back into our foundation chain. And I'm going to show you what a single crochet stitch is going to look like once I make them. This is what a single crochet looks like. And this is what our stitches look like. If you look closely, you'll see the top of these stitches have little V shapes. That is what we call a stitch. This is a single crochet stitch as well, but as you're crocheting, this flat part is not what you're working in. This part of the stitch is going to affect how a project looks, but really, once it's done, it's pretty much useless to us. The only thing that matters once you've finished crocheting a stitch is the V at the top. So when you talk about stitches as a crocheter, the only thing you're referring to is these V's into which you're going to continue crocheting. Here is a V. There's a very nice defined V shape. That is what my hook will go into to create a stitch. You can very clearly see the V that it's being pushed into. That is what we consider a stitch as we're crocheting, because when we crochet, we're going to continue crocheting into each of these V's to create your next stitch. Now that you've crocheted all of these stitches and you've gone across the entire foundation chain that you've made, you have now created your first row of stitches. Your foundation chain does not count as a row because it's, well, your foundation chain. And it is not actually a stitch. As you can see, this is the chain. That is simply what we put our first stitches into. The chain itself does not count as a stitch. So we have now made our first row of stitches. And a row of stitch is very simply just a whole bunch of stitches that span from your first to your last stitch, or in this case, foundation chain, since we just started. Now, when you're reading patterns or going through tutorials, a lot of times things will be explained in rows. You might say that you want a single crochet from R1 to R5. Now that means you want to do a single crochet stitch for rows 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. That is what they mean when you see things like R1 and R7 and so on and so forth. It basically tells you that you need a certain amount of rows before you can complete a project, or that you need to do this type of stitch for these numbers of rows. That is our second row. We might be able to tell the difference between our foundation chain and rows a little easier now. When we made our foundation chain and then did our first row, we only had about this much of length. Now that we've done our second row, we have double the length. That's the difference between a chain and a row. A row actually is a full stitch that adds length to your project, whereas a chain is just what you make your first stitches into, and they don't actually add any length to your project. Another term you might hear often is sewing or joining pieces together. To do that, you will require a darning needle. Let's go back to my box of now many missing crochet hooks. This little unassuming needle right here is a darning needle. Now it is purple, so it's a little harder to see against this backdrop, so I'm going to try to keep it here. But a darning needle is a small, almost embroidery needle. It is plastic and it has a very big eye. This allows yarn to go through this eye so that we can pull yarn in through different stitches and basically hide the yarn away after you're done with a piece of work. You would also use it to join or sew your pieces together. What that means is if I had two of these and I wanted to bring them together, I would use this needle with the yarn in it to basically sew through my pieces and join them. Most patterns that you're going to be working with will have some form of sewing, especially if it is a clothing item. The other term that you might hear is called casting off. Now, casting off is basically when you finish off a piece. Just like we have this slip knot that holds all of the yarn together and stops it from untying, we need to do the same once we're done to make sure that it doesn't unravel from the top. As we mentioned before, this is where you would use a darning needle to sew in the tail of your yarn. So you would use this needle to pull this yarn through a bunch of different stitches so you can hide it, and then cut it so that you don't see this unsightly piece of yarn hanging off of your perfectly crocheted sweater. Arguably, one of the most important things that you need to know when it comes to crocheting is tension. While I was creating this absolutely glorious piece of crocheting, you might have noticed me wrapping the yarn around my finger multiple times. The reason I do this is to maintain and create tension. So what is tension? Simply put, tension is how tight or how loose you pull or hold a string while you crochet. If you pull the string tightly, you're going to create more tension. If you keep it pretty loose, there's going to be less tension. Stronger tension leads to tighter stitches. Looser tension leads to, well, looser stitches. This means that tighter tension can also lead to smaller stitches, and looser tension can lead to bigger stitches. At the end of the day, it doesn't matter what type of tension you're keeping. Of course, it might matter for how your project looks at the end of the day, but the type of tension that you prefer is completely up to you. There is no one right tension. However, the best tension is consistent tension. If you're going to be keeping really strong tension for most of your work and then keep loose tension for 1 or 2 stitches, they're going to pop out immediately. Let me try to show you an example. Here are 2 rows of stitches. This bottom row of stitches is a tighter tension. As you can see, the stitches are much closer together and they tend to be a little less see-through. This top row of stitches was done with a looser tension. This means that the stitches themselves are looser. As you can see through the stitches a lot easier, and they are further apart. As you can tell, the ones with looser tension also tend to look a little wider. If you pull this out this way, you can see that the top row stitches look like they're a little longer than the bottom row stitches. This is what I mean by tension playing a big part in how your piece and how your stitches look. Now, if you were going for something that you wanted to look a little airier, this top row of stitches could be perfect. So a looser tension might be exactly what you want. However, if you wanted something that has a much tighter feel and a less of a see-through feel, tighter tension might be what you're looking for. At the end of the day, the most important part about both of these rows are that they are relatively consistent tension. All of the stitches on the bottom row are pretty closely packed. All of the stitches on the top row are pretty loosely packed. So it doesn't matter whether I did a looser or a tighter tension. What matters is that they look relatively even. However, imagine you had a row of stitches, half like this and half like this. Now that's going to look really weird, especially if you have a row of this and then one really tight stitch and then a row of really loose stitches. That's when the issues come in. The tension at the end of the day isn't the most important part of it, but the consistency in your tension is the most important part. If you want your piece to look even and you want your stitches to look consistent, tension is how you maintain that consistency. But it's also important to note that if you're crocheting a piece and it doesn't end up looking like what someone else's piece looks like, especially when you're looking at it in terms of dimensions, lengthwise and widthwise, tension might be the answer. If you have a piece that has tighter tension and it's looking maybe about 2 centimeters smaller than someone else's piece, it's likely because you might have tighter tension than they do. If you have a piece that looks a little bigger than someone's, it might be that you have looser tension than they do. That's why things like gauge swatches are important. Remember this label? And when we talked about this little square that we ignored, we called it a gauge swatch and we said we'd come back. This is what I'm talking about. A gauge swatch is a 4 by 4 inch square, which you use to measure your tension. If I made a 4 by 4 square of this in tight tension, I could count how many stitches are along the 4 inches of this square and how many rows I fit into 4 inches of a square. When I look at that, I can understand my tension as compared to the tension that this square talks about. Usually when you're using it in a pattern, people will have a gauge swatch that they put in their pattern and will say this is how many rows and how many stitches I have in my gauge swatch, which means that if you don't match it, your final product might look different than mine. In here, it's showing you that a 4 by 4 inch square should have 18 stitches going across the bottom and 24 rows going up. So if I did a 4 by 4 square with a 5mm hook in this yarn and I had more than 18 stitches on the bottom and more than 24 rows along the side, it likely means that my tension is tighter. Now, as a beginner, it's not something that you really have to get too caught up in because a lot of the projects that you're going to be working on are likely not going to be that dependent on size and accuracy. Now that we've got all of the relevant terminology out of the way, let's move into materials, specifically what you're going to need for this course and what my personal recommendations are, especially for a beginner crocheter. Let's start with hooks. We're going to be using a 5.5mm hook for this entire course. You will not need another size for the duration of this course. As a beginner, I would strongly recommend getting an aluminum hook. Of course, at the end of the day, the material of hook that you get is completely up to you. Getting a different material will not affect the way that you learn, and it won't affect your finished project. For yarn, we're going to be using acrylic yarn throughout this entire course. Again, you won't be needing a different type of yarn at any point during the 10 modules coming up. For this course, I would also highly recommend using brightly colored yarns. Using colors like dark blues, blacks, dark greens, anything that's a little duller and a little harder to see is going to make it tougher for you to see your stitches and learn where to put your stitches, how they're supposed to look, and really distinguish between stitches. If you're using bright colored yarn, it's going to be a lot easier to see that, and it's going to be a lot easier for you to learn. Again, especially as a beginner, I would highly, highly recommend getting bright colors. My personal favorites are bright blues, bright yellows, reds, all of those colors that just pop and you can really see each strand of yarn really easily, even once you've crocheted a piece. One of the last things we're going to go over are materials that you really don't need, especially as a beginner crocheter. These are things that you can absolutely buy once you've been crocheting for a little bit longer, once you're more comfortable with it and you know that it's something you want to stick with. That could be a great time for you to elevate the tools that you currently have, but as of right now, you really don't need any of these that we're going to go over. The first thing you don't need is a pair of craft scissors. Any pair of scissors will do fine. If you have a pair of kitchen scissors, you can use that. If you have a pair of nail clippers, you can use that. Trust me, I've used it when I'm in bed and I'm too lazy to get out and find my actual scissors. But at this point, you really don't need a specific pair of scissors dedicated to cutting your yarn. You can use anything that you have lying around. Just not a knife. I wouldn't suggest waving around a knife trying to cut your yarn off. Stitch markers. I promise you do not need stitch markers right now. You're really only going to use these once you get to crocheting in the round, which will take a little time, and there will be a module that's dedicated to this. Even once you get to that point, you don't necessarily need stitch markers. You can use things like safety pins or anything that really fits into a stitch. I did buy stitch markers, and that was after I'd been crocheting for years, and I decided I wanted to feel a little bit more official. Up until that point, I just used loose threads of yarn that I had lying around just to mark my stitch so I knew where I stopped. Again, it's something that you can invest in as you continue to crochet, but it's not something that you need right now. The last thing that you don't need is a set of hooks. As I said before, we're only going to be using one hook for the duration of this course. Even as you're trying different patterns, different tutorials, as a beginner, chances are they're going to ask you to use a hook that's about 5 millimeters to 6 millimeters. Having a 5.5 millimeter hook is the perfect size as a beginner. If you end up investing in a set of hooks this early, chances are you're going to continue to experiment with different hooks and find something that you like, and it might be a completely different material from the set that you have right now. Now that we've gone through the whole of Crochet 100, you might be sitting there and asking yourselves, who the hell is this person and why should I be listening to them about crocheting? Like, who are they to tell me how to crochet? Well, thank you for asking. I'm Leanne, and I've been crocheting for about 5 years now. Like some of the crocheters that I've mentioned in my videos so far, I used to be able to crochet a really cool kitchen towel or a really cool block of fabric, but I had no idea how to translate that into something better. So very recently, I started learning how to make things like amigurumi or stuffies, and elevating the skills that I've had all of this time. I've just never known how to apply it to these patterns or these projects that seem too scary and too daunting and too advanced for someone like me. That's why I started this channel and this course. I really want to share the information that I've learned over the past 5 years, but more specifically over the past year or so, where I've actually pushed myself to try new things and realize that it wasn't impossible for me to do that. That I had all of the skills that I needed to read a pattern, I just never knew how to. That I had all of the skills that I needed to make a really cute stuffed axolotl for my friend, I just never knew that I could. I want to give everyone the tools to have a really great crochet foundation and to know how to continue to build on it. Now that you can make a really great single crochet square, what are all of the things you can do with that knowledge? That's what I want to share with you. That's what this course is going to help you do. As a novice crocheter, you can leave this course with all of the skills and all of the information that you need to try any crochet project that your heart desires. And I want to give that to you because I've been there. I've been at the point at which I felt stuck and I felt like there's them and there's me, and I will never be an amazing crocheter, but I want to show you that you can. I'm just here to help you push yourselves a little bit more and try that one thing that's always been so scary. And we'll be learning together. There are so many things that I still have to learn in the crocheting world, and I'm so excited to share that with you guys. So we're going to go through these journeys of watching me fail miserably at things as we learn, but that's how we learn. With all that said, if you enjoyed the video, please like and subscribe so you can get access to all of the modules as soon as they're out and get more content just like this. You can also drop a comment below and tell me what you're most interested in learning about, or something that you struggled with for a while when it comes to crocheting. I really hope you enjoyed this video and you enjoyed learning a bit more about the foundations of crocheting and a little bit about me. And I hope that I'll catch you next week in Crochet 101. See ya!